Good evening and welcome back to Tucked In Tuesday. I know lots of you have been anxiously awaiting our return since the end of last school year, so we're super excited to get started again. For those of you who have not joined us for Tucked In Tuesday before, or if you're brand new to RGS, Tucked In Tuesday is a weekly video series where I will read a story to your friends, and I will also read part of a chapter book. Something new for Tucked In Tuesday this year, is that it's not only just going to be me reading stories to you, we are going to have guest readers from around the building read to you as well. When we're all done reading Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, which is our new book, our new novel, when we're done reading this week, I'm going to give you a little bit of a clue as to who next week's reader might be. You'll have to tune in, of course, to find out who that's going to be. This week, our picture book is Pumpkin Soup. We have Halloween coming up pretty soon, and with it being fall this time of year, reading about pumpkins is always fun. So we have Pumpkin Soup, which is written and illustrated by Helen Cooper. So we're going to read that, and then when we're finished, we're going to start Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, which is one of my most favorite stories. Growing up, I loved this book, and I hope you enjoy it as well. All right, let's get started and read Pumpkin Soup. Pumpkin Soup by Helen Cooper. Deep in the woods, there's an old white cabin with pumpkins in the garden. There's a good smell of soup, and at night, with luck, you might see a bagpiping cat through the window, and a squirrel with a banjo, and a small singing duck. Pumpkin soup, the best you ever tasted. Made by the cat who slices up the pumpkin. Made by the squirrel who stirs in the water. Made by the duck who scoops up a pippin of salt and tips in just enough. They slurp their soup and play their song, then pop off to bed in a quilt stitched together by the cat, embroidered by the squirrel, and filled with fine feathers from the duck. And it's peaceful in the old white cabin. Everyone has his own job to do. Everyone is happy. Or so it seems. But one morning, the duck woke up early. He tiptoed into the kitchen and smiled at the squirrel's special spoon. Wouldn't it be fine, he wondered, if I could be the head cook? He drew up a stool, hopped on top, and reached until his beak just touched the tip of the spoon. Kerplunk! Down it clattered. Then the duck trotted back to the bedroom, held up the spoon, and said, "Today it's my turn to stir the soup." "That's mine," squeaked the squirrel. "Stirring is my job. Give that back." "You're much too small," snapped the cat. We'll cook the way we always have." But the duck held on tight until the squirrel tugged with all his might, and whoops, the spoon spun through the air and bopped the cat on the head. Then there was a horrible squabble, a row, a racket, a rumpus in the old white cabin. "I'm not staying here," wailed the duck. "You never let me help with anything." And he packed up a wheelbarrow, put on his hat, and waddled away. "You'll be back," stormed the cat, "after we've cleaned up." And the squirrel shook his spoon in the air, but the duck didn't come back. Not for breakfast, not even for lunch. "I'll find him," scoffed the cat. "He'll be hiding outside." "I bet he's in the pumpkin patch." But the duck was not in the pumpkin patch. They could not find him anywhere. So they waited all that long afternoon. The cat watched the door. The squirrel paced the floor. "That duck will be sorry when he comes home," they muttered. But the duck didn't come home, not even at soup time. The soup wasn't tasty. They'd made it too salty. They didn't feel hungry anyway. They both sobbed over supper, and their tears dripped into the soup and made it even saltier. "We should have let him stir the soup," sniffled the squirrel. "He was only trying to help," wept the cat. "Let's go out and look for him." The cat and the squirrel were scared as they wandered down the path in the dark, dark woods. They feared for the duck, all alone with the trees and the foxes and the wolves and the witches and the bears, but they couldn't find him. On and on they trudged until they reached the edge of a steep, steep cliff. "Maybe he fell down that," wailed the cat. "I'll save him," squeaked the squirrel, and he scrambled down on a long, shaky rope. He searched all around on the ground, but he couldn't find the duck. Then the cat whispered in a sad little voice, "Duck might have found some better friends." "He might," sighed the squirrel, "friends who let him help." And the more they thought about it, as they plodded back, the more they were sure they were right. But when they were almost home, they saw a light shining from the old white cabin. "It's Duck!" they shrieked as they burst through the door. And the duck was so happy to see them. He was also very hungry, and though it was late, they thought they would all make some pumpkin soup. When the duck stirred, the cat and the squirrel didn't say a word. Not even when the duck stirred the soup so fast that it slopped right out of the pot. Not even when the pot got burnt. Then the duck showed the squirrel how to measure out the salt, and the soup was still the best you ever tasted. So once again, it was peaceful in the old white cabin, until the duck said, "I think I'll play the bagpipes now." The end. I hope you enjoyed that story. I really like the way at the end of the book the friends can come together and know that it's okay if somebody's not stirring the soup the right way or if somebody's not doing something exactly the way they should, that it's okay and that they can still be friends at the end. It's a really good story, really good message for you to remember. All right, now it's time to move on to Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. I'm going to read the back side too, because remember the back of our chapter books often tell us what the book is going to be about, so listen close. All right. Two's a crowd when Peter and his little brother Fudge are in the same room. Grown-ups think Fudge is absolutely adorable, but Peter and his pet turtle Dribble know the truth. From throwing temper tantrums to smearing mashed potatoes on the wall, Fudge causes mischief wherever he goes. And this book is written by Judy Blume. If you've heard it, don't tell anybody what's going to happen. And if you have not heard it yet, I hope you enjoy it. You're in for a treat. All right, chapter 1 is called The Big Winner. I won Dribble at Jimmy Fargo's birthday party. All the other guys got to take home goldfish in little plastic bags. I won him because I guessed that there were 348 jelly beans in Mrs. Fargo's jar. Really, there were 423, she told us later. Still, my guess was the closest. Peter Warren Hatcher is the big winner, Mrs. Fargo announced. At first, I felt bad that I didn't get a goldfish, too. Then Jimmy handed me a glass bowl. Inside, there was some water and 3 rocks. A tiny green turtle was sleeping on the biggest rock. All the other guys looked at their goldfish. I knew what they were thinking. They wished that they could have tiny green turtles, too. I named my turtle Dribble while I was walking home from Jimmy's party. I live at 25 West 68th Street. It's an old apartment building, but it's got one of the best elevators in New York City. There are mirrors all around. You can see yourself from every angle. There's a soft, cushioned bench to sit on if you're too tired to stand. The elevator's operator's name is Henry Bevelheimer. He lets us call him Henry because Bevelheimer is hard to say. Our apartment's on the 12th floor. But I don't have to tell Henry. He already knows. He knows everybody in the building. He's that smart. He even knows I'm 9 and in 4th grade. I showed him Dribble right away. I won him at a birthday party, I said. Henry smiled. Your mother's going to be surprised. Henry was right. My mother really was surprised. Her mouth opened when I said, just look at what I won at Jimmy Fargo's birthday party. I held up my tiny green turtle. I've already named him. Dribble. Isn't that a great name for a turtle? My mother made a face. I don't like the way he smells, she said. What do you mean, I asked. I put my nose right down close to him. I don't smell anything but turtle. So Dribble smells like a turtle, I thought. Well, he's supposed to. That's what he is. And I'm not going to take care of him either, my mother added. Of course you're not, I told her. He's my turtle, and I'm the one who's going to take care of him. You're going to change his water and clean out his bowl and feed him and all of that, she asked. Yes, I said, and even more, I'm going to see to it that he's happy. This time, my mother made a funny noise, like a groan. I went into my bedroom. I put Dribble on top of my dresser. I tried to pet him and tell him he would be happy living with me. But it isn't easy to pet a turtle. They aren't soft and furry, and they don't lick you or anything. Still, I had my very own pet at last. Later, when I sat down at the dinner table, my mother said, I smell turtle. Peter, go and scrub your hands. Some people might think that my mother is the biggest problem. She doesn't like turtles, and she's always telling me to scrub my hands. That doesn't mean just run them under water. Scrub means I'm supposed to use soap and rub my hands together. Then I've got to rinse them and dry them. I ought to know this by now. I've heard it enough. But my mother isn't the biggest problem. Neither is my father. He spends a lot of time watching television commercials. That's because he's in the advertising business. These days, his favorite commercial is the one about Juicio. He wrote it himself. And the president of the Juicio company liked it so much he sent my father a whole crate of Juicio for our family to drink. It tastes like a combination of oranges, pineapples, grapefruits, pears, and bananas. And if you want to know the truth, I'm getting pretty sick of drinking it. But Juicio isn't my biggest problem either. My biggest problem is my brother, Farley Drexel Hatcher. He's 2.5 years old. Everybody calls him Fudge. I feel sorry for him if he's going to grow up with a name like Fudge, but I don't say a word. It's none of my business. Fudge is always getting in my way. He messes up everything he sees. And when he gets mad, he throws himself flat on the floor and screams. And he kicks. And he bangs his fists. The only time I really like him is when he's sleeping. He sucks 4 fingers on his left hand and makes slurping noises. When Fudge saw Dribble, he said, "Ooh, see." And I said, "That's my turtle. Get it? Mine. You don't touch." Fudge said, "No touch." Then he laughed like crazy. Chapter 2 is called Mr. and Mrs. Juicio. One night, my father came home from the office all excited. He told us that Mr. and Mrs. Yarby were coming to New York. He's the president of the Juicio company. He lives in Chicago. I wondered if he'd bring my father another crate of Juicio. If he did, I'd probably be drinking it for the rest of my life. Just thinking about it was enough to make my stomach hurt. My father had invited Mr. and Mrs. Yarby to stay with us. My mother wanted to know why they couldn't stay at a hotel like most people who came to New York. My father said that they could, but he didn't want them to. He thought they'd be more comfortable staying with us. My mother said that was about the silliest thing she'd ever heard. But she fixed up Fudge's bedroom for our guests. She put fancy sheets and a brand new blanket on the hide-a-bed. That's a sofa that opens up into a bed at night. It's in Fudge's room because that used to be our den. Before he was born, we watched TV in there, and lots of times Grandma slept over on the hide-a-bed. Now we watch TV right in the living room, and Grandma doesn't sleep over very often. My mother moved Fudge's crib into my room. He's going to get a regular bed when he's 3, my mother says. Excuse me. There are lots of reasons I don't like to sleep in the same room as Fudge. I found that out 2 months ago when my bedroom was being painted. I had to sleep in Fudge's room for 3 nights because the paint smell made me cough. For one thing, he talks in his sleep. And if a person didn't know any better, a person could get scared. Another thing is that he makes slurping noises while he sleeps. It's true that I like to hear them when I'm awake, but when I'm trying to fall asleep, I like things very quiet. When I complained about having to sleep with Fudge, my mother said, "It's just for 2 nights, Peter." "I'll sleep in the living room," I suggested, "on the sofa, or even on a chair." "No," my mother said, "you will sleep in your bedroom, in your own bed." There was no point arguing. Mom wasn't going to change her mind. She spent the next day in the kitchen. She really cooked up a storm. She used so many pots and pans that Fudge didn't have any left to bang together. And that's one of his favorite pastimes, banging pots and pans together. A person can get an awful headache listening to that racket. Right after lunch, my mother opened up the dinner table. We don't have a separate dining room. When we have company for dinner, we eat at one end of the living room. When Mom finished setting the table, she put a silver bowl filled with flowers right in the middle. I said, "Hey, Mom, it looks like you're expecting the president or something." "Very funny, Peter," my mother answered. Sometimes my mother laughs like crazy at my jokes. Other times she pretends not to get them. And then there are the times when I know she gets them, but she doesn't seem to like them. This was one of those times, so I decided no more jokes until after dinner. I went to Jimmy Fargo's for the afternoon. I came home at 4 o'clock. I found my mother standing over the dinner table mumbling. Fudge was on the floor playing with my father's socks. I'm not sure why he likes socks so much, but if you give him a few pairs, he'll play quietly for an hour. I said, "Hi, Mom, I'm home." "I'm missing 2 flowers," my mother said. I don't know how she noticed that the 2 flowers were missing from her silver bowl because there were at least a dozen of them left. But sure enough, when I checked, I saw 2 stems with nothing on them. "Don't look at me, Mom," I said. "What would I do with 2 measly flowers?" So we both looked at Fudge. "Did you take Mommy's pretty flowers?" she asked him. "No take," Fudge said. He was chewing on something. "What's in your mouth?" my mother asked. Fudge didn't answer. "Show Mommy." "No show," Fudge said. "Oh, yes." My mother picked him up and forced him to open his mouth. She fished out a rose petal. "What did you do with Mommy's flowers?" She raised her voice. She was getting really upset. Fudge laughed. "Tell Mommy." "Yum," Fudge said. "Yummy, yummy, yummy." "Oh, no," my mother cried, rushing to the telephone. She called Dr. Cohn. She told him that Fudge had ate 2 flowers. Dr. Cohn must have asked what kind because my mother said roses, I think, but I can't be sure. One might have been a daisy. There was a long pause while my mother listened to whatever Dr. Cohn had to say. Then Mom said, "Thank you, Dr. Cohn." She hung up. "No more flowers," she told Fudge. "You understand?" "No more," Fudge repeated. "No more, no more." My mother gave him a spoonful of peppermint-flavored medicine, the kind I take when I have stomach pains. Then she carried Fudge off to have his bath. Leave it to my brother to eat flowers. I wondered how they tasted. Maybe they're delicious and I don't know because I've never tasted one. I decided to find out. I picked off one of the petals from a pink rose. I put it in my mouth and I tried to chew it up, but I couldn't do it. It tasted awful. I spit it out in the garbage. Well, at least now I know I wasn't missing anything great. Fudge ate his supper in the kitchen before our company arrived. While he was eating, I heard my mother remind him, "Fudgy's going to be a good boy tonight. Very good for Daddy's friends." "Good," Fudge said. "Good boy." "That's right," my mother told him. I changed and scrubbed up while Fudge finished his supper. I was going to eat with the company. Being 9 has its advantages. My mother was all dressed up by the time my father got home with the Yarbys. You never would have guessed that my mother spent most of the day in the kitchen. You also never would have guessed that Fudge ate 2 flowers. He was feeling fine. He even smelled nice, like baby powder. Mrs. Yarby picked him up right away. I knew she would. She looked like a grandmother, the type that always makes a big deal out of Fudge. She walked into the living room cuddling him. Then she sat down on the sofa and bounced Fudge around on her lap. "Isn't he the cutest little boy?" Mrs. Yarby said. "I just love babies." She gave him a big kiss on the top of his head. I kept waiting for somebody to tell her that Fudge was no baby, but no one did. My father carried the Yarby suitcases into Fudge's room. When he came back, he introduced me to our company. "This is our older son, Peter," he said to the Yarbys. "I'm 9 and in 4th grade, I told them. "How do, Peter," Mr. Yarby said. Mrs. Yarby just gave me a nod. She was still busy with Fudge. "I have a surprise for this dear little boy," she said. "It's in my suitcase. Should I go get it?" "Yes," Fudge shouted. Go get. Mrs. Yarby laughed as if it was the best joke she'd ever heard. "I'll be right back," she told Fudge. She put him down and ran off to find her suitcase. She came back carrying a present tied up with a red ribbon. "Oh," Fudge cried, opening his eyes wide. "Goody," he clapped his hands. Mrs. Yarby helped him unwrap his surprise. It was a wind-up train that made a lot of noise. Every time it bumped into something, it turned around and went the other way. Fudge liked it a lot. He likes anything that's noisy. I said, "That's a nice train." Mrs. Yarby turned to me. "Oh, I have something for you too, Peter," I reminded her. "My name is Peter." "Yes, well, I'll go get it." Mrs. Yarby left the room again. This time she came back with a flat package. It was wrapped up too, red ribbon and all. She handed it to me. Fudge stopped playing with this train long enough to come over and see what I got. I took off the paper very carefully in case my mother wanted to save it, and also to show Mrs. Yarby that I'm a lot more careful about things than my brother. I'm not sure she noticed. My present turned out to be a big picture dictionary, the kind I liked when I was about 4 years old. My old one is in Fudge's bookcase right now. "I don't know much about big boys," Mrs. Yarby said, "so the lady at the store said a nice book would be a good idea." A nice book would have been a great idea, I thought, but a picture dictionary? That's for babies. I've had my own regular dictionary since I was 8, but I knew I had to be polite, so I said, "Thank you very much. It's just what I've always wanted." "I'm so glad," Mrs. Yarby said. She let out a long sigh and sat back on the sofa. My father offered the Yarbys something to drink. "What a good idea," Mr. Yarby said. "What will it be?" What will it be, Mr. Yarby repeated, laughing. "What do you think, Hatcher? It'll be Juicy-O. That's all we ever drink." "Good for your health," Mr. Yarby pounded his chest. "Of course," my father said, like he knew all along. "Juicy-O for everyone," my father told my mother. She went into the kitchen to get it. While my father and Mr. Yarby were discussing Juicy-O, Fudge disappeared. Just as my mother served everyone a glass of Mr. Yarby's favorite drink, he came back. He was carrying a book, my old worn-out picture dictionary, the same one as the one the Yarbys just gave me. "See?" Fudge said, climbing on Mrs. Yarby's lap. "See book?" I wanted to vanish. I think my father and mother did too. "See book?" Now Fudge held it up over his head. "I can use another one," I explained. "I really can. That old one is falling apart." I tried to laugh. "It's returnable," Mrs. Yarby said. "It's silly to keep it if you already have one." She sounded insulted, like it was my fault she bought me something that I already had. "Mine," Fudge said. He closed the book and held it against his chest. "Mine, mine, mine." "It's the thought that counts," my mother said. "It was so nice of you to think of our boys." Then she turned to Fudge. "Put the book away now, Fudgy." "Isn't it Fudge's bedtime?" my father hinted. "Oh, yes, I think it is," said Mother, scooping him up. "Say goodnight, Fudgy." "Goodnight, Fudgy," my brother said, waving at us. Fudge was supposed to fall asleep before we sat down to dinner, but just in case, my mother put a million little toys in his crib to keep him busy. I don't know who my mother thought she was fooling, because we all know that Fudge can climb out of his crib any old time he wants to. He stayed away until we were in the middle of our roast beef. Then he came in carrying Dribble's bowl. He walked right up to Mrs. Yarby. He thought she was his new friend. "See," he said, holding Dribble under her nose. "See, Dribble?" Mrs. Yarby shrieked, "Oh!" Oh, I can't stand reptiles. Get that thing away from me. Fudge looked disappointed, so he showed Dribble to Mr. Yarby. See, he said. Hatcher, Mr. Yarby boomed. Make him get that thing out of here. I wonder why Mr. Yarby called my father Hatcher. Didn't he know his first name was Warren? And I didn't like the way that Mr. Yarby and Mrs. Yarby both called Dribble a thing. I jumped up. Give him to me, I told Fudge. I took Dribble and his bowl and marched into my room. I inspected my turtle all over. He seemed all right. I didn't want to make a big scene in front of our company, but I was mad. I mean, really mad. That kid knows he's not allowed to touch my turtle. Peter, my father called, come and finish your dinner. When I got back to the table, I heard Mrs. Yarby say, it must be interesting to have children. We never had any ourselves. But if we did, Mr. Yarby told my father, we'd teach them some manners. I'm a firm believer in old-fashioned, good old manners. So are we, Howard, my father said in a weak voice. I thought Mr. Yarby had a lot of nerve to hint that we had no manners. Didn't I pretend to like their old picture dictionary? Isn't that good manners? If it's not, then I don't know what is. My mother excused herself and carried Fudge back to the room. I guess she put him in his crib again. I hope she told him to keep his hands off my things. We didn't hear from him again until dessert. Just as my mother was pouring the coffee, he ran in wearing my rubber gorilla mask from last Halloween. It's a very real-looking mask. I guess that's why Mrs. Yarby screamed so loud. If she hadn't made so much noise, my mother probably wouldn't have spilled the coffee all over the floor. My father grabbed Fudge and pulled the gorilla mask off him. That's not funny, Fudge, he said. Funny, Fudge laughed. Funny, funny, Fudgy. Yes, sir, Hatcher, Mr. Yarby said. Old-fashioned manners. By that time, I'm sure my father was sorry that the Yarbys weren't staying at a hotel. I finally got to go to bed at 10. Fudge was in his crib slurping away. I thought I'd never fall asleep, but I guess I did. I woke up once when Fudge started babbling. He said, buh, 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 whatever that means. I didn't even get scared. I whispered, shh, and he did. Early the next morning, I felt something funny on my arm. At first, I didn't wake up. I just felt this little tickle. I thought it was part of my dream, and then I had the feeling somebody was staring at me, so I opened my eyes. Fudge was standing over me, and Dribble was crawling around on my arm. I guess Fudge could tell I was about ready to yell because he bent down and kissed me. That's what he does sometimes when my mother's angry at him. He thinks nobody can resist him when he makes himself so lovable, and a lot of times it works with my mother, but not with me. I jumped up, put Dribble back into his bowl, and yelled at Fudge. He didn't like it. He hollered. My father came running into the room. He was still in his pajamas. He whispered, "What's going on in here?" I pointed at Fudge and he pointed at me. My father picked up my brother and carried him off. "Go back to sleep, Peter," he said. "It's only 6 o'clock in the morning." I fell asleep for another hour, then woke up to an awful noise. It was Fudge playing with his new train. It woke everybody up, including the Yarbys. But this time there was nobody they could blame. They were the ones who gave Fudge the train in the first place. Breakfast was a very quiet affair. Nobody had much to say. Mr. Yarby drank 2 glasses of Juicio. Then he told my father that he and Mrs. Yarby had their suitcases packed. They were leaving for a hotel as soon as breakfast was over. My father said he understood, that the apartment was too small for so many people. My mother didn't say anything. When Mr. Yarby went into Fudge's bedroom to pick up his suitcase, his voice boomed, "Hatcher!" My father ran toward the bedroom. My mother and Mrs. Yarby followed him. I followed them. When we got there, we saw Fudge sitting on the Yarby suitcase. He had decorated it with about 100 green stamps, the kind my mother gets at the supermarket. "See," Fudge said. "See, pretty," he laughed. Nobody else did. Then he licked the last green stamp and stuck it right in the middle of the suitcase. "All gone," Fudge sang, holding up his hands. It took my mother half an hour to peel off her trading stamps and clean up the Yarby suitcase. The next week, my father came home from the office and collected all the cans of Juicio in our house. He dumped them into the garbage. My mother felt bad that my father had lost such an important account. But my father told her not to worry. Juicio wasn't selling very well at the stores. Nobody seemed to like the combination of oranges, grapefruits, pineapples, pears, and bananas. "You know, Dad," I said, "I only drank Juicio to be polite. I really hated it." "You know something funny, Peter?" my father said. "I thought it was pretty bad myself." All right, we're going to stop there. I hope you have enjoyed the first couple of chapters of Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. I think you're going to think it's pretty funny when you find out the things that Fudge does and how Peter and his friends handle him. All right, so as I told you before, next week you're going to have a guest reader read you a picture book and then the next 2 chapters of Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. I'll give you a clue. Our next reader, she has been teaching for a really long time. See if you can figure out who that is. Have a great night, boys and girls. I hope you enjoyed our time together, and I hope you read lots of books throughout the week, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Have a good night.